Muslims around the world are suffering. From China to Kashmir to Syria and Lebanon, and in many other countries.
Even in America, Muslim students struggle to find good schools that are strong in the Islamic knowledge. Help the Association of Islamic Charitable Projects support and strengthen our Muslim communities. Donate generously this Ramadan for the benefit of your Muslim brothers and sisters. Visit gofundme.com/AICP fund.
بالخير هيا بنا نلقاه في يومنا يا سادتي يا كرام سيروا لنيل المنى بالخير هيا بنا نلقاه في يومنا يا سادتي يا كرام سيروا لنيل المنى سيروا لنيل المنى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah for all of the endowments He bestowed, without Allah, the Exalted, being obligated to give anything. Thereafter, we correct our intentions, seeking reward from Allah, the Exalted only, for sitting in the session of remembrance of the Islamic beneficial matters. So we're reviewing together the integrals of the prayer. In the previous session, we talked about additional integrals of the prayer. Before that, we had talked about the first four integrals of the prayer, having the intention in the heart, saying the Allahu Akbar statement, and standing for the one who is able, and that these things would be simultaneous. Yani one would have the intention in their heart while saying Allahu Akbar, and they would be standing if physically able. And we mentioned that one must recite the Fatiha, and their recitation of the Fatiha, according to the Shafi'i madhab, the Shafi'i school, must include the Basmalah, the saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and that they must pronounce all of the doubled letters, the shaddat, the letters that have the shadda on it, for the validity of the recitation, and that the recitation must be in its well-known order. The person recites it in his well-known order, not out of order, and that there must be succession in the expressions of Al-Fatiha, so one would not pause without an excuse between the expressions of Al-Fatiha, what is more than what is considered the silence of breathing. They wouldn't make a long pause that is more than the silence of breathing, which is the duration that a person would take normally to take a breath, to breathe, while they were having conversation, for example. While they were talking, they would take a moment to breathe, and that this duration, it is actually longer than the tuma'nina duration. Then, in the previous lesson, we went from there mentioning the fifth integral, and we got all the way up to the 14th integral. So we mentioned the bowing until one's palms could reach one's knees, considering the person of an average physique, and that they would have stillness in that position. Then that one would raise up returning to the position that they were upon after they would raise up, returning to the position that they were upon before the bowing, and they would have stillness in this position, and then that one would make sujood 2 times, putting their uncovered forehead, the inside part of the hands, both knees, and the underside of some of the toes of each foot on the ground, and that their lower half would be higher than their upper half, and that they would have a slight amount of pressure on the forehead, and that they must be still also in that position in the 2 prostrations, and that one would sit between the 2 prostrations and also have stillness in that position. And then after one repeated all of that, which is considered 1 rak'ah, from the standing while reciting Al-Fatiha till the 2nd prostration, that would be 1 rak'ah. And so one will repeat that the necessary amount of times that the prayer that they are praying calls for, that at the end of the prayer they would sit for the saying of at-tashahhud, and that they would recite the tashahhud. And we mentioned that the tashahhud was narrated, it was conveyed from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in more than one format, and in more than one recitation, with a variety of expressions. They weren't all the same, and that for one to recite any of these conveyed versions would suffice for one. From there, we will continue and mention the 15th integral of the prayer, which is to say the salah upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Sheikh mentioned that the minimum salah ala nabi, the minimum salah upon the Prophet, is for one to say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. He said it does not mean that one must say this exact expression. And there are other ways that a person might send the salah on the Prophet that would suffice, that would be sufficient and valid to cover this integral in the prayer. He said it does not mean that one must say this exact expression letter for letter, meaning that it doesn't mean that in that it is not permissible to replace any of them with something else. Rather, saying sallallahu ala Muhammad or the like is also permissible. Or if one, instead of saying ala Muhammad, they said ala Rasulillah, that would also suffice. So if one said sallallahu ala Rasulillah, that would be sufficient, that would be permissible for fulfilling the integral of sending the salah on the Prophet. Or if one said ala Nabi, if they said sallallahu ala Nabi, instead of saying sallallahu ala Muhammad, that would also fulfill the obligation. He said this is opposed to one saying sallallahu ala Ahmad instead of Muhammad. That would not be valid. Or if one replaced the name of Muhammad with a pronoun only by saying sallallahu alayhi, for example, or by just saying ar-Rasul, sallallahu ala Rasul, instead of saying sallallahu ala Muhammad or sallallahu ala Rasulillah, rather they just said sallallahu ala Rasul, that this would not suffice. So just saying sallallahu alayhi, using the pronoun instead of the proper name, or saying sallallahu ala Rasul, that is not sufficient for the sending the salah on the Prophet, which is an integral among the integrals of the prayer. Then he said the 16th integral, which is to say the closing salam, the minimum of which is assalamu alaikum. Among the conditions for the validity of the closing salam is for one to utter the al, what we call al-ta'rif, or it has different names. here when we say Assalamu alaikum. Here, it's called the al, but here, because the first letter in salam is a sin, and this is called a shamsiyya letter, or a sun letter. The rule of the sun letters is that when you put the alif lam in front of it, according to the language that we're using of the Arabs, the Arab, the lam would be silent and the sin would be doubled. We would pronounce it with a shadda. And that's like all of the shamsiyya letters. So the al, it's there, but you don't hear the lam letter, you hear a doubled sin. So we say Assalamu alaikum. So the Sheikh is mentioning here that one must say Assalamu alaikum, not just Salamun alaikum, Salamun alaikum, because this is leaving out the al, so it would not be sufficient. If one prayed the prayer and then at the end to finish the prayer they just said Salamun alaikum, that is not sufficient. That does not fulfill the obligation. He said, likewise, it is not sufficient to replace the word alaykum with like another pronoun like alaik. For example, here you have two words that are joined together. You have ala and then you have the pronoun kum. Ala and kum. Kum here is the pronoun. Usually it's used for plural masculine, or if it was mixed gender, so you had masculine and feminine for a second person, yani for someone who you're addressing. So it would be plural, that is three or more of masculine, or three or more mixed gender, masculine, males and females. And it's also used for other reasons. One must use this expression, this pronoun, when they're making the closing salam, saying Assalamu alaikum. Because if they said Assalamu alaik, leaving out the meme at the end, it would not suffice. It would not fulfill the obligation. He said, succession between the two words, and to say it loud enough to hear oneself, and to be facing the prayer direction with one's chest for the duration of its utterance, yani for the whole time that one is saying it, until one completes it, yani from the beginning of Assalamu alaikum till the end of Assalamu alaikum, are all conditions. So a person would also be mindful, because if a person was rushing, they might start the salam while facing the qibla, but then turn away from the qibla before they finish it, saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, for example, turning away from the qibla, and then that would be invalidated. That salam would be invalidated. He said, as for the most perfect version, it is by adding wa rahmatullah. And one says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This is the most perfect version, without saying wa barakatuh. However, some scholars chose to add wa barakatuh in addition to that for the perfect salam in the prayer. And this was narrated by Abu Dawood in some hadith about the first salam. We say the salam, we say it twice at the end of the prayer. It's obligatory to say it only once. So if a person just said Assalamu alaikum, for example, at the end of their prayer, even if they didn't turn to the right and to the left, and even if they didn't say it 2 times, that would be sufficient to fulfill the obligation of saying the salam. But as you may know, it is better, it is recommended to turn to the right saying the salam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and then say it a second time turning to the left, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. But the Sheikh is mentioning here that some sheikhs, some scholars did mention that it's actually better to add wa barakatuh. Then the final integral among the integrals of the prayer is to observe the order. So we mentioned in this particular order the integrals of the prayer, starting with the intention, saying Allahu Akbar, standing for the one who is able, reciting the Fatiha, bowing, having stillness in that position, coming back up after bowing, having stillness in that position, prostrating twice, having stillness in that position, sitting between the two prostrations, having stillness in that position, sitting for the final tashahhud, the salah upon the Prophet, and the salam. So that's 16 altogether. And this is the 17th integral of the prayer, to observe the order. He said, observing the order is in the integrals, observing the order in the integrals of the prayer, as they were mentioned in this listing that we just gave you, is necessary. Included in that is the intention being simultaneous with the opening saying of Allahu Akbar while standing for the able. So these things, as we mentioned before, they would actually occur all at once. The intention saying Allahu Akbar while standing. He said, as for the recitation of the Fatiha to be during the, he said, and for the recitation of the Fatiha to be during the standing, and for the tashahhud and the salah upon the Prophet to be during the final sitting. He said to intentionally perform the integrals of the prayer out of order, like intentionally prostrating, making sujood before one's bowing, before one's ruku', for example, to recite the Fatiha, and then to go down to the ground and make the sujood, that's the integral of the prayer. Instead of bowing, one doing that intentionally, this invalidates the prayer. And this is just an example. He said, whoever abandons the order by saying the salam before its proper place, or bringing forward any integral of action, invalidates the prayer by the unanimity of the nation. This is if the person does it, what? Intentionally. They do it on purpose. So, to say the closing salam before the end of the prayer, before one gets to the final sitting and they recite it, what has to come before it, invalidates the prayer. Or to intentionally do another integral of the prayer out of order, this also invalidates the prayer. He said, if one forgets to perform an integral, one must return to perform it unless one has reached that same integral or what is after it in the next or subsequent cycle of the prayer, the next or subsequent rak'ah of the prayer. In such a case, what was performed in between is canceled. That is, what was performed in between the integral that he forgot, he left out forgetfully, and it's similar in the following or subsequent rak'ah that he actually performed. Everything in between those two things, the forgotten integral and its likes in the subsequent rak'ah, everything in between is canceled. It's void, as if he didn't do it. That is, it is not counted because it was not performed in its proper place. But because he forgot, we don't say that invalidates the prayer. It immediately invalidates the prayer. Thus, he immediately returns to the forgotten integral to adhere to observing the order. This is what he does. If a person remembers forgetting an integral before he reached its likes in the subsequent cycle, the subsequent rak'ah, then he immediately returns to that forgotten integral and performs it. And it's an obligation for him to do that immediately. He said this is the case if he remembers before reaching its likes in the following cycle. However, if one remembered and he had reached its likes in the following cycle, that is, he didn't remember until after reaching its likes in the following cycle, with that, the previous cycle is completed. That is, when he reached and performed the integral that resembles the forgotten integral in the previous cycle, then his current performance of this integral is the completion of the previous integral. Likewise, if one remembered after reaching it, after reaching its likes of the forgotten after reaching the likes of the forgotten integral. So if a person, he's mentioning here, if he didn't remember about the integral that he forgot until after, and after he performed a similar integral in the following cycle. If a person, for example, forgot to bow in the first rak'ah, and then he didn't remember that, and so he prostrated twice, he sat between the two prostrations, he stood back up to pray the second cycle, he recited the Fatiha, he bowed in the second cycle, and then he stood up from the bowing and remembered that he hadn't bowed in the first cycle. Or he stood up from the bowing and then prostrated and then remembered that he hadn't bowed in the first cycle. Then in this case, that bowing that he did perform in the second cycle, it is the completion of the bowing that he skipped forgetfully in the first cycle. He said, thus, the previous integral was completed when one performed the likes of the forgotten integral. And what was between the forgotten integral and the likes of it that was performed in the subsequent cycle is void. This is the judgment for other than the follower. As for the follower, if he forgot an integral, he does not immediately return to it. Rather, he performs an additional cycle after the prayer, after the leader, the imam, says the salam of his prayer, after he finishes. So if a person was following the imam, and the imam was praying and he was following the imam, and then this person, this follower, realized that they had actually left out an integral, and they had left the place of that integral and moved on to what's after it, then this person, this follower, even if he didn't reach the likes of that forgotten integral in the subsequent rak'ah cycle of the prayer, he doesn't go back and perform the forgotten integral. Rather, what he does is he continues following the imam, and then after the imam finishes his prayer by saying the salam, the follower stands up and performs an additional cycle of the prayer. The Sheikh mentioned here a particular judgment, a specific case. He said, the doubt is like remembering in this case. Thus, if one bowed, then doubted if one recited the Fatiha or not, or doubted while prostrating, did one bow and stand up from that or not? And did he perform the bowing and then return to the position that he was in before bowing or not? He doubts, did I perform that or not? It is obligatory that he stands immediately, and it does not suffice to stand into the bowing position. So in this case, the doubt is like remembering that he actually didn't do it, that he forgot it. So the person, if he doubts if he performed a previous integral and he hadn't reached its likes in the previous, he hadn't reached its likes in the following rak'ah, then he is obligated to immediately return to that forgotten integral and perform it. He said, as for the one who doubted if he recited the Fatiha in the current cycle while he was standing before bowing, it is not obligatory upon him to recite it immediately. And if a person was standing in the standing that is in which a person recites the Fatiha, not the standing where he returns after bowing, he's in the standing position in which one recites Al-Fatiha. Then he doubted, did I recite the Fatiha? It's in his mind, possibly he did, possibly he didn't. In this case, he's not obligated to immediately start reciting the Fatiha because he doubted, because he has not changed positions, leaving the position in which the Fatiha is recited. And he's still in the position in which one recites the Fatiha, thus he's not immediately obligated to return to reciting it immediately due to a doubt. He said, however, he must recite the Fatiha before bowing if his doubt does not vanish before the bowing. So if he doesn't return to certainty that he actually recited the Fatiha before going into the bowing position, he would actually be obligated to perform the Fatiha again if that doubt persisted before he goes into the bowing. And if he was in the standing position, if I misspoke, if he was in the standing position in which one recites the Fatiha and he doubted, did I recite the Fatiha or not? He's not obligated to recite the Fatiha again immediately. However, if the doubt does not go away, if the doubt does not subside, then he's obligated to recite the Fatiha before he goes into the bowing position. طيب, and with that, we'll stop here. The Sheikh does have another benefit to mention. God willing, we'll mention that in the next lesson. If Allah the Exalted will for us to reach that, we will talk about it then. Alhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Rabbi ghfirli wa lil mu'minina wal mu'minat. Jazallahu Muhammadan anna khayra. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Muslims around the world are suffering. From China to Kashmir to Syria and Lebanon, and in many other countries.
Even in America, Muslim students struggle to find good schools that are strong in the Islamic knowledge. Help the Association of Islamic Charitable Projects support and strengthen our Muslim communities. Donate generously this Ramadan for the benefit of your Muslim brothers and sisters. Visit gofundme.com/AICP fund.